It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I've really enjoyed listening to all the talks and seeing the posters today, and it's fantastic to see such amazing research being carried out in schools right the way across the UK, so thank you very much for inviting me. I was asked to give you a sort of a talk about the context, I suppose, of why I first got involved with the Well World project, or the precursor to that, with Sam, with the Simon Langton Girls Grammar School in Canterbury. And the reason really is my background. I've always really liked insects. So I like the natural world, and I particularly like insects. I was interested to know, actually, how many of you, most of your projects have been on sort of more of the physical side of things, a bit to do with humans, but how many in the audience like insects, or actively like them? That's pretty good, that's about a third. How many of you actively dislike insects? Don't be shy. About a third as well. So we've got basically a third like them, a third dislike them, a third are kind of insect ambivalent. So what I'm going to try and do is, over the next half hour or so, give you a little bit of a background to insects, why I think they're important, I suppose, why I think they're interesting, why I'm interested in studying them, but also about their losses. I'm really a conservationist, so I'm interested in finding out what we can do to increase insect numbers again, and also what that means for us, what that means for people, why people should care about species disappearing, and, of course, insects in particular. So that's a sort of a focus for the next half hour or so. I'm told I'm meant to make these talks more interactive. This is the moment not to make eye contact with me, of course. I was wondering, a show of hands actually, I suppose, makes it a bit easier, but how many species there might be in the world? You'll probably cover this during your courses, actually. So, I mean, yeah, actually got answer, yes. 900,000? That's a very good guess. How many, of insects or all species? All species. That's a pretty good guess. Any advance on 900,000? How many people think it's over 1 million? Show of hands. Over 5 million? Keep your hands up. Over 10 million? Keep your hands up. Over 20 million? Over 100 million? In the world? So, of course, it's a very unfair question. The answer, of course, is we don't know. What I can tell you is that there's probably about 1.2 million species named. So actually, for named species, your answer was a really, really good one. It was very close. It was a very close guess. There's loads being described every single year, so we're getting new species every single day, so about 36 new species being named in the day. So since we've been sitting in the conference here, probably about 15 or 20 species have been named, publications have come out. So we live in this extraordinarily undiscovered world. That's what the world's really like. We kind of imagine that, I mean, listen to the talk this morning, sequencing all of the eukaryotic species in the world is a bit of a tall order at the moment because we don't know how many there are. We've been studying these things pretty comprehensively for 250 years, and I can't hand on my heart tell you whether there's 5 million species on the planet or 100 million. And it depends very much where you look, whether you're thinking about the large-bodied things, whether you're talking about the very small-bodied things. Thinking about what species have actually been formally named, well, then only a very tiny fraction of those actually have. Funny, I've lost one of the things. And of those, a vast majority, perhaps, are insects, roughly 900,000. So you know, most of the named species, in fact, the large-bodied things, are insects. I thought I'd bring you in a fairly new species so you can kind of have a look at what these things look like. Good thing about insects is you can kind of carry things around. So this is a fairly new species. This is rather a beautiful thing. This is the Peruvian black beauty stick insect. Oops. Goes straight for your face. So for those of you, I won't bring it in the audience, they're rather beautiful. So this was a thing that was first named, as you can see, first discovered in 2002, first named in 2005. It's from a single valley in Peru. It's rather a fiercely beautiful thing. This is quite a large insect, and yet this was only formally named kind of 2005. So these sorts of things are being discovered every single day. There's all of these amazing things around. If you want to, you can come have a look at this afterwards. Very happy to show it to you. So in terms of the total number of species, that's what we've got shown here, so in blue. The vast majority of things in blue here are insects or things closely related to insects. That's what the world's really like. We don't realise that because we're large-bodied things, and so we see things which are large-bodied. But this is where we sit here. We're in amongst the chordates, including all the vertebrates, us and mammals and birds and everything, fish you can think of. We're a tiny, tiny slither of that total diversity of life. That's what the world's really like. As I say, big chunk of those is insects. In amongst the insects, a big chunk of these is beetles. So amazingly, roughly 400,000 of these things are beetles, and the numbers are still going up every single day. It's a remarkable world. So if you were to put this in context and thinking more about the importance of insects, why insects are interesting for me, why they should be important for everyone, This is a speciescape. This shows that number of species placed as a kind of picture. And what you can see is, this is what, again, what the world's really like in terms of number of species. It's dominated by this enormous beetle, the insects. And then you've got other kind of major groups, spiders being very important, seaweeds, algae being very important, and then little minor things like mammals. We're really not very important, not in terms of number of species. Interestingly, when you look at it in terms of the biomass, if you go out and actually scrape all these things together, dry them and weigh them, that's what you call the biomass in the system, this is what the world's really like as well. Again, the insects dominate. This is based on real data from the Amazonian rainforest, and what we've got here is the social insects represented by this monstrous ant. And the butterfly here, the rest of the insects, dominating again in terms of the sheer amount of stuff in the ecosystem, with things like mammals and birds being relatively unimportant. They look large and we see them, but scrape them together and they don't count for very much. Put that together, of course, and insects dominate in terms of what actually happens in a system, what we'd call ecosystem services, what these ecosystems are doing for us, for people. They're key for all of these different functions that happen. Particularly, I mean, everyone knows about pollination in insects nowadays, but it's not just that. Insects are also the things that decompose stuff. They break down leaf litter, they integrate it in the soil profile. They get rid, in this case here's a rather beautiful dung beetle, they get rid of dung. And without this, we'd be literally up to our knees in our own poo. So we really, really rely on insects for all of these different things. Even if we don't see them, even if we don't like them, even if we don't care about them, they're doing all of this for us the whole time, and for natural ecosystems as well. They're also really important because they're very often pest species. They feed on our crops, and they're also species like this rather beautiful assassin bug that feeds on those species. So they're also important for pest control. This is called an assassin bug. I don't know if you can see. It's a true bug, but it's got this rather beautiful little hooked mouth here. So it's literally got a mouth like an assassin's blade. So what it will basically do is it'll sneak up behind caterpillars and things feeding on crops, sink its mouth part in, and then literally suck the insect dry. So insects, really, you know, nature is really red in tooth and claw. Of course, all of these small things will also be providing food for everything else. So all of these larger bodied things will be feeding on insects. So they underpin a lot of the way these ecosystems actually work. Unfortunately, there's lots of evidence. I work in the Museum of Zoology, as Becky said, in Cambridge. I don't know how many of you have been to the Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. If you're locally based, do come and visit us. We're open every day of the week apart from Mondays, free entry, fantastic things. And you can find out a lot about the history of specimens, a history of science in that wonderful place. One of the things we can look at with historical collections and also historical records is how insects are doing over time. And it becomes clear when you start looking at this that lots of insects are in decline. This is a particularly famous example. This is the Rocky Mountain locust, Rocky Mountain grasshopper, it's sometimes called. This is probably the most numerous insect to have ever lived. So one swarm in the 1800s estimated to be 198 square miles in size. That's about the same size as California, to put that in a state's context. This is extraordinarily numerous, and yet the last one died out in 1902. So this was a species that was more numerous than you can imagine, and then it did dwindle down to nothing. The reason in this individual case was because it seems like, although they were spread very widely, they only bred in certain areas, and those areas were being converted to agriculture at the time. And so what happened was human habitat changed, caused this species to go extinct. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends very much on your point of view, because this would have probably been a major crop pest. But still it's gone. So there's individual examples like this of really dramatic species losses. If you start looking in amongst museums, places that I work, you'll find that these aren't exceptions. These are rather the norms. Insects, and indeed lots of species across the natural world, are declining very, very rapidly. This is a local example. I think malaria was mentioned this morning in the talk, the fens being this kind of reservoir of malaria and various other things, ague as they used to call it in this part of the world. It was also an incredible reservoir of biodiversity. And that, like malaria, has also disappeared. This is an example of this museum. This is the large copper butterfly that disappeared in about the 1870s, something like that. It was found around Cambridge up until about 1850. And the reason it disappeared was because this has a food plant which only grows in the fens. It only grows in wetland areas. So when the food plant disappeared, the butterfly disappeared. What it became was some of the most productive agricultural land in the world. But what we tend to overlook is the things that we lost along the way. This was an endemic subspecies that was only found in the UK, found nowhere else in the world. So the only time you're going to see this is in photographs like this or visiting museums like Cambridge. So the world's changing, and it's not a one-off. This is an example, but actually when you start looking, this kind of story plays out again and again. We've got fantastic historical collections in Cambridge, particularly work of this guy. This is a guy called Leonard Jennings, who was a contemporary of Darwin. And he lived in Cambridge up until about the 1850s. He made this huge collection of insects, which he donated to the museum. And what we can basically do is we can go back and look at these insects, particularly work. This guy's Matt Hayes in my group, who spends a lot of time looking at these historical collections, particularly finding out where they were collected. So this is a specimen from Leonard Jennings' collection that was collected by Darwin. They used to swap beetles. It was kind of like the sort of equivalent, I suppose, of kind of stamp collecting in those days, beetle collecting. They used to send them to each other. Amazing kind of imagine, really. But these are a completely invaluable record, because what, of course, it means is you can time travel. You can find out what would have been living in Cambridgeshire or in local areas 150, 200 years ago. Extraordinary thing. And when you start looking at that, what you find is that things like the large copper, if you look at Leonard Jennings' diary, it's not just present there, actually it's not uncommon. It's found around Cambridgeshire. Other things that have disappeared, this rather beautiful swallowtail butterfly, we still have this in the UK, but now it's restricted to the Norfolk Broads. This was found in the greatest plenty throughout the fens between Ely and Cambridge. This disappeared in Cambridgeshire in the 1950s. So we live in a world which has changed. Without things like historical collections, we're in danger of ignoring that, because we tend to have very, very short memories. So insects are important, and unfortunately insects are in decline. A lot of the work that my group does or is interested in finding out is why they've declined, things that drive those changes. I've already hinted at this at different parts of the talk, but one of the key things is habitat change. We do work in the UK, we also do work in Southeast Asia, we work with researchers in Malaysia and Indonesia, mostly collaborative projects. And one of the things we're interested in is seeing the spread of the effects of things like this. This is oil palm, which is very much in the media at the moment for its impacts on rainforests. This is a rough schematic from The Guardian. Guardian are very good at these sort of schematics, but talking about where oil palm has expanded most rapidly. The size of the red circles illustrates the size of the expansion, and what you can sort of see is it's based out here. This is Southeast Asia. Malaysia and Indonesia are the biggest producers for palm oil, which is in absolutely everything. We've probably all enjoyed palm oil in our delicious lunches today. Of course, one of the things we might be interested in is this is obviously a huge production. It's very, very important worldwide for a vegetable oil. But one of the things my group does is study what impacts this has on the ecosystem, what impacts this has on the way ecosystems work. This is an example of some work from Sarah Luke in our group. And what she did was basically go out into a whole range of different areas in Southeast Asia, and she studied these things. These are termites, very, very numerous in the tropics, really important for soil processes. They move the soil around and they break down dead wood and things like that, so really, really key. And what she was able to show was that old growth forest had this extraordinary diversity of termites. These are all different functional groups. They all do slightly different things. And what she found was that when the forest was logged and then when the forest was converted to oil palm, this huge diversity of different termite groups dropped right off. So not only are we losing species, we're actually losing the way the ecosystem works. Other work from Tom Fail, who was also in our group at the time, he works on ants particularly, so ants and termites, and he's particularly interested in invasive species. This is something called the yellow crazy ant. So called because it's yellow and it runs around in a crazy manner when it's disturbed, so it's very easy to identify. And it's a major invasive. So it moves into habitats, but mostly after people have disturbed them. And one of the things it does is it eats everything else. It's an incredibly effective predator. So you can see dozens of these things taking down a beetle many times their own sizes. And one of the things that Tom found was when you compare oil palm compared to forest, you get a far higher number of non-native things. So things like this yellow crazy ant mostly, things that have moved in, species of ants that have moved in this oil palm plantation compared to the forest. So forest conversion leads to a loss of a lot of these species which are found there. They'll often be doing things in the ecosystem, and then when you've disturbed it, other things will move in and start to change the system even more. So perhaps no surprise that when you convert fenlands to agriculture, when you cut down rainforest and convert it to oil palm plantation, an awful big chunk of that extraordinary diversity of insect life disappears. That's one of the things our group is interested in looking at. We've also got projects working in the UK, based much more locally around here, trying to understand the impact of habitat change, but also the impacts of climate change. And I want to just illustrate one more to give you a kind of an idea of the sort of diversity of different projects that we're lucky enough to work on. This isn't based in the rainforests in Southeast Asia. This is based on the chalks of Bedford, particularly near lovely Luton. And here we've got a whole network of fantastic sites owned and managed by the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire Wildlife Trust. Fantastic organisation, you should all be members. And they really safeguard these last patches, in this case, of chalk grassland habitat. Incredibly diverse. It's the UK's example, UK equivalent of a rainforest. And what our groups have been interested in doing is finding out a little bit about the butterflies that are found there, and particularly a bit about their temperature. So what we do is we go out, so we've got groups of volunteers and also our students here going out and collecting butterflies. They survey them. And each time they find a butterfly, they record the species, they record its size, and then they use this, which is a very, very fine temperature probe, which you can touch onto the thorax of the butterfly, the middle bit of the butterfly, and you can take its temperature. So the nice thing is with this, you can work out the temperature of the environment, the temperature of the butterfly, and with that you can work out how well a butterfly can control its temperature. I think you're often kind of taught in school, you've got warm-blooded things and cold-blooded things. The cold-blooded things, the ectotherms, being the ones that kind of are more passive. They rely on the temperature in the environment. That's not really true. Actually, insects, although they're so-called ectothermic, they can control their temperatures really well, particularly butterflies, because of course they've got these huge solar panels, basically, their wings, so they can turn towards the sun, turn away from the sun, heat themselves up, cool themselves down. Now, you can already see this in the context of climate change. If you're one of these species that can control your temperature, actually climate change is going to affect you much less. If you're one of these things that can't, it's going to affect you much worse. And one of the things our group has been doing is looking at just that. This is Andrew Bladen, a postdoc in our group, who's been measuring thousands upon thousands of butterflies' temperatures. And he's been finding out that essentially when you've got a difference in temperature, some species, like this is a small white, the large white, is able to kind of buffer its temperature really well. So when it's cold, it has a rather warm temperature. When it's warm, it has a rather cool temperature. Other things, this is my favourite species, is the Duke of Burgundy butterfly. It's got the dubious honour of being the most threatened butterfly in the UK at the moment. It's really rubbish at this. So in cold conditions, it's almost as cold as the environment. In warm conditions, its temperature spikes. So when you start comparing across groups, it's really, this really has a key impact on how well the species can do in terms of responses to climate change. So really sort of important work, I think. So insects are threatened because of habitat change, they're threatened because of climate change, and also loads of other interacting factors as well. I think especially for insects, one of the things that really has a bad impact on them is the lack of awareness. They're one of these groups that slips through the net because people don't care about insects, they don't like insects perhaps, or they don't notice them. We've done a bit of work in the museum looking at this as well. So just to remind you, this is what the world really looks like in terms of the biomass of insects. This is what the biomass numbers tell us in terms of how important insects are. If you ask people in the museum, rather as I did today actually, if you ask people to draw their favourite animal, this is the speciescape you get from this. This is for children visiting the museum, and what you tend to see is that it's almost the inverse of what the natural world's really like. You tend to get things like mammals and birds being very represented, and things like insects being represented by this rather beautiful butterfly being rather underrepresented. So insects have got that special problem in that they're overlooked, even though they're functionally really, really important. So I want to kind of finish off in the last couple of bits of the talk to think about whether this actually matters or not. We've got this extraordinary diversity of species. Does this loss really matter? Maybe we've got enough species to cope with it. And I think it really does matter, and there's lots of different reasons for that. The first set are functional reasons. These are kind of selfish reasons for us, if you like. It matters because of what insects do for us or what diversity generally does for us. This is function. Let's think back to what all those things that insects do. Well, they're important pollinators. So something like 35% of the world's crops rely on insect pollinators, rely on pollination. Lose these and we lose the crop production. We really can't afford to do that. We're going to be peaking at over 9.5 billion people by 2050. We need to be upping crop production, not losing it because we're thoughtlessly throwing away biodiversity. Interestingly, it's not just species, it's not just numbers of pollinators that are important for this, it's diversity. This is quite a classic bit of work now by Claire Krein et al. What they did was they looked across loads of different systems and they looked at the number of bee species and the abundance of bee species and the fruit set of this crop, which is coffee, but it applies to lots of other crops as well. And what they found was that the number of species was the thing that really determined the fruit set, determined how much crop you actually got, not the abundance of individuals. And this sort of makes sense when you come at it from an ecology point of view, because as we saw, insects are diverse, bees are diverse. There's not one species, there's thousands of species. And each of those bees is going to be doing something slightly different. Some get up early in the morning, some get up late in the morning. Some go to the middle of the crops, come to the top of the crops, edge of the crops, rainy days, wet days, cold days. They're all doing slightly different things. So put that together, and having more bees means more coffee set. Every time of the year, at every point, there's going to be bees doing pollination. So it matters from that point of view. It also matters, I think, from a human well-being point of view. This is where it kind of links to the project we've been running with Simon Langton, looking at how exposure to green spaces can really promote human well-being. There's been work already looking at this across the UK. So there's a really nice study in Sheffield that looked at the diversity of habitats across green spaces in Sheffield. And they looked at kind of various different indices of well-being. It doesn't really matter what these are, but essentially if this goes up, you feel happier and you feel more grounded in place. And that, it turns out, tracks just not with green space in general, but number of species in the green space, diversity of that green space. And the thing we were able to do with Simon Langton, a kind of photo of Sam here for you, and this is also Kate Howlett, who's my PhD student working on this as well. What they were able to do in the schools, and what's been replicated with the World Project, is look at this diversity, in this case, across orchards in the school, which are very diverse, compared to playing fields, athletic tracks, compared to the school corridors. You can see the diversity dropping right down, and this is an index of well-being that follows the same pattern. So not just generally, not just in the world, but in schools in particular, being exposed to these sort of greener and more biodiverse environments actually makes you feel better. I don't know if that chimes with people in the audience. Certainly I feel happier if I'm walking around outside in a green space than I might do, for example, in a school corridor. Insects are an important part of that because they underpin a lot of these different functions. And of course, there are other reasons, which sometimes as conservation scientists, we tend to be a little bit more squeamish about talking about. These are things like just general future benefits, thinking to the future, what information might these species contain? And also moral arguments as well. Each of these species has a completely unique evolutionary history. They're completely individual. Each one of these 1.2 million species named has got that amazing evolutionary history. We lose that, and we lose that information. This is put really nicely by this guy. This is, you may not recognize this is Alfred Wallace, who was the co-discoverer of natural selection with Darwin. And he was also a great environmental thinker. This is writing in 1881. The kind of knowledge of world fauna and fauna is of very slow growth and is still very imperfect. In many cases, it can never now be obtained owing to the reckless destruction of forests, and with them, countless of species of plants and animals. This was in 1881. So you can imagine the changes there have been since then. This is information we can't get back. It's really, really important that we preserve this stuff for now and for future. I didn't want to finish on a down note. I wanted to kind of like finish in the last couple of slides just thinking about what's being done about it. And there's an awful lot of hope as well. So there's no doubt there's loads of biodiversity loss, and that biodiversity loss really matters for us. There's also truly groundbreaking projects happening all over the world which are helping to slow this loss and also reverse it. And I'm hoping, again, a lot of your generation will be key to that, really involved with that, because ultimately getting people involved with conservation is the only way it's actually going to work. Thinking about the wildlife trusts, well, they've got huge restoration projects going on across the country, particularly in this part of the world. This is where we do a lot of our butterfly work. This is a quarry, ancient quarry, which has got loads of beautiful chalk grass and plants in it in Bedfordshire. This is what it was like when we first started working on it in 2006. It was 2 isolated habitats, relatively small. Between then, what's happened is that local people have clubbed together and they've bought the Wildlife Trust extra land. It's linked together these 2 areas. The area itself become about 4 times the size. That's an extraordinary good hope story, and that's not isolated. There's lots of examples of that. Our group's involved with projects like this as well, working with industry to, again, this is oil palm plantation, but what we're doing in the project here is we're restoring forest. We're not reconverting whole oil palm estates. We need the palm production for foods, but what they're doing is they're putting forest back along the river margins in an experimental design in this case, so we could study how easy it is to do, and the best way of doing it. That's important because from the plantation point of view, is it reduces erosion, it reduces fertilizer runoff into the streams. From a biodiversity point of view, of course, it connects up the landscape again. This is conservationists working with industry. This isn't something that would have happened in Southeast Asia in oil palm context even 10 years ago. So again, sign for real hope. And I think probably the last kind of sign for hope is the increased engagement of people, yourselves, with research. And I think that goes right back to you guys doing research in schools, but it also involves the so-called citizen science, everyone being involved with research because there's all these amazing projects online that you can help with. That could be classifying galaxies on a website, or it could be helping take part in big butterfly counts or big bird counts, recording the number of species found in your own garden, and then for submitting that information online. This is some of the best records we have across the UK to show how our wildlife is doing. It's not being collected by scientists, being analysed by scientists, but it's being collected by thousands, tens of thousands of members of the public all over the UK. And again, that's not just happening in the UK, that's happening worldwide. What a fantastic opportunity to engage people in the natural world and also benefit wildlife. In our small way, we're also doing this in the museum as well, of course, because we've got an increased public engagement programme trying to, again, promote some of the amazing collections that we've got to really link people with the natural world and with the importance of historical collections. So, I'm going to skip forward. I'm going to run out of time. I'm worried about your timing. So what I've tried to do then is give you an overview of why I think insects are important. Hopefully, how many of you now like insects? A bit of a dangerous question to ask. Oh, come on. Certainly more, anyway. There's a kind of like maybe half the audience. But hopefully I've kind of like hopefully planted the seeds that maybe more of you will be interested in insects in the future. They're incredibly important. They're incredibly diverse. They're incredibly beautiful. There's an endless amount of information that things like this contain. Each and every individual species is unique. They're also very important for us because the sheer amount of stuff that they do in the natural ecosystems and in terms of supporting our own crops. So they're very important for that, and unfortunately they're in trouble. Luckily, there are lots of things we can do to reverse these declines of insects. It's not a one-way journey towards a less and less diverse world. The thing is that we have to act now, because although time's running out, it's not yet too late. So I'm going to finish there so that we don't run out of time and you'll go off. But thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today.
Just wondering, with the current sort of legislation we've got in place, which bans the use of certain insecticides or pesticides, as well as sort of managing the conservation of our biodiversity areas, with most of those coming from Europe, with us moving away, is that going to set us back, basically?
I think we're in very uncertain times, as we are for many other things. I wouldn't like to double guess. You're right, a lot of the legislation so far, I think probably on average we've been a beneficiary in terms of that environmental legislation. I don't know where we'll be in the future. In some cases we've led, in lots of other cases we've very much followed. I think the hopeful sign is if we can listen to research, we're in slightly uncharted waters, I think, but if we can listen to research, I think we're moving away from this idea that you can either have production and kind of well-managed landscapes or biodiversity to a point where actually a lot of this biodiversity is really important for people, for well-being, but also for crop production. And so I'm hoping that if there are changes in the way that legislation happens post-Brexit, whatever it is, that's taken into account. So I think that would really change the way that the relationship we have with farmers, with food producers and things like that. Yeah. So question mark, basically.
Thanks. Hi, I wondered what you thought about the idea of insects as a source of food.
Yeah, so it's a really popular idea at the moment. I mean, I think there's certainly, there's millions of people worldwide, billions of people worldwide use insects for food. It's difficult to know exactly how many. So there's been estimates that 3 billion or 4 billion people worldwide eat insects, almost half the number of people. But that's usually based on country. So it's probably far fewer than that in reality. But certainly it's an important part of the food stuff for lots of people worldwide already. I think it's potentially a very good idea for several reasons. One is that insects tend to be rather more efficient at kind of like keeping your energy levels up the food chain and things compared to a cow, for example. So you can have insects feeding on plant material and then eat the insects as a protein source without losing so much of that energy. All that said, we're still probably better off moving towards more of a vegetable-based diet because that's always going to give us more food on less land area. So I think there's a compromise there. Where I do think it's a complete no-brainer is where you've got a byproduct insect. And that can often be the case. When we grow our crops, if we, as an evolutionary biologist, if I was to sort of set up a system where I wanted to get loads of pest species, what I'd do is I'd basically grow the same crop over huge areas and give exactly the same conditions. What you get is one species dominating and eating everything. And that's the sort of system we're at. But luckily, a lot of those pest species are actually edible. So I think there's a possibility there for mechanising some of this and actually gleaning those species, whether that be locust outbreaks or whether it be certain species of caterpillar, and actually using that as a byproduct. In that case, we're not competing with food sources at all. We're not feeding corn to insects to eat the insects. We're actually eating the corn. we're catching the pests and we're eating those as well. So I think that's a really hopeful sign. And we're not, at the moment, I'm not aware of anything that's been mechanised for that. From modern agriculture, a load of it's mechanised, so you can be really efficient about pesticide application or herbicide application or whatever else it be, or fertilisers. Insects should be possible to be harvested in the same way, because again, nearly all insects are edible. There's a few which are poisonous or kind of protected, but most of them aren't. So you could literally have some sort of mechanical device hoovering them all up, and either eating them ourselves or potentially, I suppose, you could use them in other parts of the food industry. I think that's very hopeful.
A last quick question, Roger. Oh, and here as well. Roger, do you want to go first?
Sure. Speaking of hoovering up the insects, I was wondering what fraction of insect species are capable of flight?
That's a really good question. So it's not an easy answer. So the majority of insect species have come from a group which have evolved flight. So in terms of number of species, a very high proportion. So the only insects which are in the insects but have never had wings at some point in their evolutionary history are things like silverfish. So Thysanerans and bristletails, Arcanathra, their own kind of sister groups. So silverfish are the only ones that haven't got flight. That said, of course, a lot of insects have got larval stages which aren't flightless. So in terms of number of individuals, probably the vast majority don't have flight because they're not yet adults or not yet full adults. So it's quite a tricky question. And of course, other insects have secondarily lost flight, and that's very patchy. So think of things like fleas, which have taken on a parasitic lifestyle, or often things on islands lose their power to flight, because if you're on an island and you fly away, most of the time you're just going to end up in the sea. On average, in terms of number of species, the majority can fly.
What can our students and as teachers do today? What can we go home and do and put in our gardens to help replenish and enrich the insect
I'm really
population?
pleased you asked that. It's almost like I planted you in the audience. Oops, sorry. Yeah. I didn't have time for this, but this is one of the things I wanted to kind of say. Insects, the important thing about, or the useful thing about insects is that they're small. So when you're trying to conserve a tiger or something like that, you're going to be having to conserve really huge areas and connecting large areas of habitat. It's rather difficult for people to get involved with that in a very personal way. You can do, but it's mostly about donating money or things like that. With insects, of course, with a lot of us, so apparently 87% of households in the UK have got access to a garden, or if not, you've got access to a local green space, or if not, you've definitely got access to a window box. And all of these different things can promote insect diversity. And it really can, because insects operate on a small scale. So if you want a kind of like a tick list of things to do, if you've got access to a garden or a school, the thing to do, you could turn it into a project, couldn't you? The thing to do is to basically not be so tidy. This is the really easy fix. So don't cut all the grass short. Insects tend to like the grass long. It doesn't need to look untidy. In fact, it can look rather lovely. But let it grow longer. That provides a whole range of resources for insects. You can put in key habitat features, which are useful for insects. Wood piles are fantastic. Any sort of water source is great. That's sometimes problematic in a school context, but it doesn't need to be huge for this to work. It really doesn't. And of course, you can use more specific things as well. This is one of these so-called bee houses. Some of the things you see in garden centres are completely useless with all the lovely little bits of fluff and things. That's not going to help very much. Wood pile's much better. But where this will really help is a group of very important pollinators called cavity nesting bees. And they particularly go for these things. They look like bamboo poles, but in the wild it will be the ends of blackberry bushes and stuff where it's kind of like an empty hole. And they'll nest in there and they'll raise their young in there. These aren't kind of social bees, so you won't get thousands. But there's loads and loads of solitary bees. They don't particularly sting, they're not aggressive, but they're really fantastic pollinators. And the thing that they always lack is a nesting site. So put these in, really easy to make, and you'll get these bees turning up. Probably not the first year, maybe the second year, and increasingly the third year. So it's a game of waiting, but it will really, really benefit pollinators. And it's also fascinating as well. It's got fantastic biology. So these little things will go out, and they're basically little solitary bees. So the females will mate. They'll find one of these little holes to lay their eggs. They'll basically collect loads of pollen. They'll bring it back and make a kind of pollen ball, and then they'll lay their eggs on it. The larvae will hatch and feed on the pollen and pupate in there and then emerge next year. But because this resource is rare, they don't just want to put one pollen ball and one egg in each of these. So what they do is they stopper it up with soil. That's what you can see here. They go and get soil and stop at the end. And they'll do that first of all. So one nest there. Then they'll do the same for the next nest there, next nest there, next nest there. Now the problem, of course, is that the bee down the end here has got to go through all of its siblings to get out. And it's also got to be going in the right direction, because otherwise it will just end up, in this case, against my shed, but in the wild, further down in amongst the blackberry bush. So they've also got this amazing bit of biology where they line up with their head facing the rough side of the mud. And if you think about it from the female's point of view, she's going to be putting the mud in. She can't smooth off the surface she's padding in next to her offspring. She can only smooth the next bit. So if you're a larvae inside, you just make sure you pupate the right way around. So you're always facing the rough side, and that means you're always going to be emerging that way out. And what happens is the ones that are here near the end develop faster than their older siblings. So what you actually end up with is they emerge in sequence, going in the right direction. Amazing bits of biology, and you can literally have that just in your own garden, in your own school. Fantastic.
That is
What's not to like?
brilliant. Honestly, so we've all got stuff to go and really get going doing stuff here. So Ed, that was absolutely an amazingly brilliant talk. I think we've all enjoyed it and been completely inspired. Can we thank you?